is our own government upholding the moral standards in which we claim to believe. So what it did was it provoked a lot of reflection about the nature of moral obligation. And in particular, the nature of moral obligation on the international sphere. So that is to say, they began asking themselves crucial questions. How should different peoples interact with each other? How should governments interact with each other? Are there absolute rules that should be observed? Well, this interaction between Spaniards and the peoples of the New World provided an unprecedented opportunity for theologians suddenly to entertain these questions. And this is where the idea of international law comes from, as these Spanish theologians are critically evaluating the behavior of their own government. They are deciding that, yes, there are moral rules. And in fact, in some cases, our own government is not obeying them. Now, the very fact that there was a crisis of conscience among Spanish theologians is itself significant. Because think, did Attila the Hun ever stop and say, you know, I shouldn't be looting and raping and pillaging like this. I mean, how dare I do these things? These people have rights just as I do. Well, of course, it never even occurred to him to ask questions like that. Or the Aztecs, for example, who engaged in human sacrifice. We have absolutely no record of any soul-searching that occurred in Aztec civilization, of people stepping back and impartially evaluating their own society and saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be ripping the hearts out of people. You know, maybe this is the wrong thing to do. Maybe this is a barbaric custom. We have absolutely no indication of any such critical tradition there. And yet, within the Catholic Church, when Spanish theologians look at the behavior of their government in the New World, that's exactly what they do. Is they begin asking these questions and they begin saying, should we behave this way? And are there in fact general rules we should observe that apply to all peoples? Attila the Hun didn't believe in rules that apply to all peoples. There were rules that applied to him and rules that applied to everybody else. And that has been the typical way peoples have understood their interaction with the world. We are the good people, everybody else is a barbarian, and we treat them accordingly. So this is an advance of no small significance. Now, we're coming up to the break, but when we come back, we're going to meet a figure of extraordinary importance, Father Francisco de Vitoria, who was a professor at the University of Salamanca, to which I have referred many a time. And it was Father Francisco de Vitoria who gave us the very first treatise in history on international law, setting out these principles. So let's come on back and look at that here on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're looking today at international law. Sounds like kind of a dry subject, but as you can see, it actually isn't at all. Because the idea of international law simply means that there are certain fixed rules that everybody has to observe. And that you can't say that, well, this people is more backward than we are, or they haven't achieved what we have, so we can just trample them, and this and that. There's nothing like that in what the Catholic Church teaches. Now, just before the break, we were talking about what happened when people in Spain began to hear about some of the abuses toward the natives of the New World at the hands of some Spaniards. And so, in fact, Spanish theologians began thinking about all the implications and consequences of this. They began thinking about the questions they needed to ask. Are there rules that should govern the interaction of peoples? What are those rules? Is our own government living up to those rules? Well, Father Francisco de Vitoria, whom I mentioned immediately before the break, was a professor at the University of Salamanca. And he has sometimes been called, along with the Dutch Protestant Hugo Grotius, who came much later, the father of international law. In fact, a man named James Brown Scott, writing in the 1920s, in a book called The Spanish Origin of International Law, tells us that Vittoria furnished the world of his day with its first masterpiece on the law of nations in peace as well as in war. Now, in a separate episode, we've discussed a little bit of the ins and outs of the just war theory. Now, what Vittoria was interested in was determining the treatment to which all human beings were entitled by right, by natural right, because they were human beings. And he insisted that these rights that people possessed came from their status as human beings, rather than because they were Catholics or anything else, Europeans, Spaniards. So their right not to be killed or not to be robbed. This comes to you not because, well, you're Catholic or you're of my race. It comes to you because you're a human being with a rational nature. And the exercise of these rights is the way in which you can live out your rational nature. You need to have a right to life. You need to have a right to own property in order to function in the world. So these things are natural rights. And they are rights that apply to everybody. So what this means in principle, in practice as well, is that no Catholic would argue that it's a less serious crime to kill somebody who's not baptized and a more serious crime to kill a baptized person because the baptized person is more important or something like that. Absolutely not. That is not what the Church teaches. And to the contrary, Father Domingo de Soto, who was Vittoria's colleague at the University of Salamanca, said this. He said, "Those who are in the grace of God, that is good, faithful Catholics, are not a whit better off than the sinner or the pagan in what concerns natural rights." Now again, isn't that kind of the opposite of the impression I think people have about the Church over the years? I think people have this impression that the Church would be inclined to give certain favor to those who belong to the household of faith. But to the contrary, as we see here, some of her finest thinkers in the 16th century say, if not the opposite, then they state something that is true for everybody. That all these rights are to be enjoyed equally by everybody because we all share a common human nature. And we aren't, incidentally, just a clump of cells. We are human beings with dignity, and that dignity demands these rights. Now, what does Vittoria conclude, looking at the situation of his government and the peoples of the New World? He said that the peoples of the New World, because they were human beings, just as we Spaniards are human beings, they were equal to us. They were equal to us in matters pertaining to natural rights. They owned their lands by the same principles that we Spaniards own our own. And he also argued that, and incidentally his fellow scholastics agreed with him, Domingo de Soto, Molina and others, that pagan princes ruled legitimately. That is to say, if a pagan king has committed no other crime, he can't simply be thrown out and deposed because he's a pagan. Now that too, I think, is the opposite of what people think. People would think that the Church believes that if a ruler is non-Catholic, they can just go in and throw him out and put a Catholic there. Well, in a certain way, I mean, I bet in the United States we wish we could do that sometimes, but that's not what the Church teaches. What the Church teaches and what Vittoria teaches here is that each state has the same rights as any other, the same rights to self-government, and is under an obligation to respect the rights of others. So regardless of the religion of the ruler, if that ruler has committed no other crime, nobody has a right to just topple him for no reason other than he's a non-Catholic. You can't simply do that. Now, Vittoria and his supporters also believed that the idea of natural law existed not just among Christians, but among all peoples. Now, natural law, of course, is the idea that there are laws that are in effect written in our human heart that we simply know. When you're a child, you know. You know these laws. You know when little children are running around, they're saying, "Hey, that's mine, give it back." They understand certain aspects of what it means to be just and fair. That I had this property first, and it's unjust for someone to confiscate it from me. And they understand perfectly well that if they take something from somebody else, they cry when you punish them, but typically they understand the punishment. They don't say, "Mom, Dad, I have a whole philosophical argument against..."